Sure. My name is Roberta Taylor, and in the board game world, people would know me from either my game Octopus's Garden, which first came out about 10 years ago, actually, or for more recently, a lot of people know me from Creature Comforts, which has just been releasing starting in April. It's from Kids Table Board Games, and yeah, and there's a few other things out there too, but those are the two most likely that people would know.
Nice. So, Roberta, what was your earliest board game memory that you have that you connected with?
I grew up with my mom playing lots of like Scrabble and Crib with me, and I think she must have played Crib with her dad growing up too, like sort of that kind of thing. I was very interested in games. In grade 7, I saved up my allowance and bought a copy of Scotland Yard, which is a good classic Ravensburger title, and bothered anyone who would play with me to do so. And then, grow up, didn't really play a lot of games until my kids were starting to get older, and the friends introduced us to Settlers of Catan, and sort of discovered that playing games with my kids was a great way to sit and hang out with them and spend time with them. And I got very interested in sort of the broader board game world that had kind of grown up and was starting to become more available in North America. And it turns out I'm way more into board games than my children. But we had a lot of fun playing games together, and I sort of like that was like the entry into like, oh, look what's out there, and discovering things like Board Game Geek, where you can kind of go and see all this huge listing of games and see what might be fun to play and stuff like that.
So when do you think your transition from board game lover to board game designer happened?
So it was I was working years ago at a job that was just like in the middle of it, was just going sideways. It was very, very unhealthy work environment, and I happened upon a Board Game Geek forum where the designer Sean Ross had a little like, hey, can you make a game with these parameters? And it was like using a tarot deck and what can you do with this kind of a thing. And I realized that this is really interesting, and I was enjoying it. And then I realized that, hey, when I'm thinking about making board games on my drive to and from work, I'm not thinking about all the awful things that went on in the day or whatever. And so it turned out to be this great sort of stress release, as well as, the more I did it, and I realized I really enjoyed it. And that also led to me being introduced to the Game Artisans of Canada, which was sort of this loose affiliation of people who were all interested in making games, and said, hey, let's share info, let's support each other, let's encourage each other. And it was all online because, of course, Canada's really big and we all are spread all over the world. But it was a really, actually a very, very, I was very fortunate to sort of have that access to those people, and there's a lot of energy around, let's learn this, let's do this, and everyone's figuring it together. So.
What do you like most about the board game design community, the local community?
I think that, it's just there's board game designers are always, thinking about the world in their own way. They're really, creative, and it tends to be a fairly small world. So you get to know folks, and whether it's locally, here in the city, or whether it's more like, even within the world. You're like, oh, if I don't know that person, I know someone who does. And if you have a question, you want to know something, you have be like, ask questions. People are just super willing to share information. There's not this big sense of, oh, that's proprietary to me or whatever. It's like really, really helpful. And everyone tends to be really encouraging, which is cool.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite things too. I guess where do you get most of your game design ideas from?
Well, there's sort of that list you always keep when you're a game designer of things that catch your attention, and I had a notebook back in the day, and Octopus Garden there, I literally wrote down the very obvious statement: octopuses have 8 arms. But what was going on in my head was, well, if an octopus was gardening, well, he'd have a watering can, and he'd have a trowel, and he'd have a plant, and it was like this funny mental picture, that I was like, hey, there's something in there for like an underwater garden. How interesting is that? And like, what would you grow? And oh my goodness, if you can't plant a starfish, it'll crawl away. And this built into the mechanics that became that game, just from this sort of little mental picture. And so that's one way that these things come. And sometimes it's more, I have a bigger story I want to tell, and it can take a lot more work to try to figure out how to do that through game mechanics. And so, yeah, it really varies, but I think that ideas are just everywhere. And what happens when you start making games, I think is probably the same, right, as if you're writing books or something, is it's not finding an idea, it's which one do you pick.
Yeah, like it's something that's actively growing now. There's just so many different things out there, and there's ways to just interpret it as a board game now. So it's really rich environment. I guess now would be a time to talk about Creature Comforts. Tell us about your game.
Sure. So Creature Comforts is a family game. So it's not aimed for children to play. It's designed for people to play, and their older children can join in, kind of a thing. And it's published by Kids Table Board Game, which is a Canadian company out of Toronto. And it's in the game, you play a family of woodland critters, or you might be porcupines or bunnies or raccoons. And you start in spring, and you work through spring, summer, and fall, because winter's coming again. And the whole game is you're collecting resources and putting together things to make your den cozy for winter. So, gameplay wise, you do that by placing your little family. You have four critters in your family out in different places in the valley, and then you roll dice and see if they succeeded at getting what they wanted or whatever. But story wise, you're collecting wool to make a blanket or like a quilt, or you're collecting berries to make herbal tea for the winter, or different things like that, to make that den cozy for when the snows come.
Well, what would you say your inspiration was to make that game designed like that?
So there were sort of a couple things. One was years ago, we were living in a very remote rural community where you're really close to the seasons, and I found that something that we sort of lose track of, how things change. Like, you can only do this one task in the spring, because that's the only time of the year it works, whatever that task might be. And so I found that really interesting, that idea of like revisiting that very seasonality. And then when I was kind of taking those ideas and whatever and putting together what became Creature Comforts, I was always very strongly influenced by the idea of cozy games from the video game world, like Stardew Valley, games like that, where you just have this really soothing experience where you just truck along and you make things and you grow and you fill your house with things. And it's like, there's something about that experience that was really comforting, and I think resonant with a lot of folks, that I wanted to capture.
What aspects of a game makes it feel very cozy, do you find?
Well, so there's like mechanically, there's things you can do to make a game feel that way. One of the big ones that I use as an example is that you don't take stuff away from players in a cozy game. That kind of punishment of any kind would never happen. And then there's just like your thematic, this is the story, these are my bunnies, and they are in this cute little den, and we're making this warm quilt. Like all the pieces you put together that like have those cozy connotations to people, that resonate with people. And so, combining both the sort of story and aesthetics and then the mechanics behind that, really is how I approached it.
Do you find that playing the game with kids is different than playing with adults?
Not hugely, you know. Kids, they're pretty smart, they're pretty quick, and they'll often pick up on gameplay really fast. I think sometimes adults are a little slower at connecting the dots of what needs to happen. I mean, it varies, of course, with everyone, but I think that kids naturally enter into that sort of imaginary space, that story space, really easily because they're still being encouraged to play, whereas as adults we've often been discouraged from doing that.
I guess I wouldn't mind talking about the artwork of the game. I feel like the artwork is very storybook-esque, and it really kind of ties in with your idea of board games making a story. Do you have a favorite piece of artwork in the game?
Oh, I love the art Shauna did in this game so much. Um, Kids Table worked really hard to find the right artist, and it shows. Like they kept looking till they found that brought this to it, and the way she uses light and stuff, it just feels warm. I think that's really beautiful, and I think my favorite piece of art in the game has to be the raven. There's these travelers that visit the inn, and one of them's a raven, and they added that as a surprise for me at the end of the Kickstarter. And I love ravens. I think all corvids are just amazing, and so interesting. And so it was really kind of cool that they threw that in. But I mean, I adore them all. I think my favorite comfort might be the pair of socks. They look so fuzzy and cozy. I just want to put my feet in them.
Yeah, just things are the components as well. They're really tactile and really fun to kind of mess around with. I think they did a fantastic job with just bringing all the pieces together.
Yeah, it was really fun working with a publisher who caught my vision and just said, okay, we know what you want to do, let's do it. Like, that was really delightful.
Nice. Do you have any favorite fan responses from Creature Comforts people have gotten in the wild?
There's just, you know what, there's been so many. It's actually mind-blowing. It's been really fun. During the Kickstarter, there was, like, of course, it was the very first winter of the pandemic, and people created this little online community, and it was actually quite adorable because as it ended, these people had been like living in the chat in the comments for 2 weeks, and they're like, oh, I'm gonna miss this. Well, tomorrow afternoon let's meet for a brandy and we'll chat online some more. Like, they built this little community. But then, as the game releases, there's just been people, really lots of, this is so great to play with my kids, or my wife and I are just loving this. Like, so many of those comments that talk about who they're playing with and that connection. And I think that's why I make games. So I love that. And it's in 13 languages. So I'm forever Google translating comments and going, oh, they love the bunnies. Oh, that makes me so happy, or whatever. So
what was your experience overall just as a designer on the designer end of Kickstarter?
So it's really interesting because I've done 3 now, and that was my first experience, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. Like, the morning it launched, I was like, oh, I sure hope this thing funds by the end of the time, right? And I mean, by mid-morning it had blown past, and we were just like, and then the whole experience, I don't know if it's technically, but if for a family game, that was very unusual for a Kickstarter to go. I think we ended over 500,000 just at the end of the Kickstarter campaign, and then they added another almost 300,000 during the period before they shut the backer kit, and just seeing people react to that was mind-blowing, but also watching how Kids Table did such a good job of engaging that community and whatever, and then comparing that with the 2 other Kickstarters that I've been involved with for 2 of my other games have been great, good people, and like no complaints, but such a different pace, very different. And one was a very, very niche. I designed a feminist war game for a professor in the States, and about the French colonization of Algeria. that's not a story that has this huge universal resonance, and so it was a very different um, pace of campaign, and then seeing that the Octopus Garden reprint again, they were just very laid back. Like, yeah, it's gonna fund. It's gonna be. We're not doing anything fancy. It's gonna be just really laid back, and I'm like, oh, cool. And so just it was really interesting in the course of like a year and a half to see all these different approaches to the platform and to how people engage with their communities and how they used it for very different goals and different expectations of what the different publishers were wanting to see out of it.
That's really fascinating. So is it historically accurate? The occupation of Algeria was a woman fought battle.
So yeah, it's so interesting. The reason that particular conflict was chosen was because the resistance to the French occupation on the part of the Kabyle people was led by this woman who was a mystic at the time, Fadma al-Sumer. And so not only was it led by a woman, but in that culture, in cases of extreme need, women would join in combat. And there's some amazing stories out of that, and it was really, really interesting because the whole point of it was to look at history from a different angle. So we were really focusing on these communities. You have children, you have old men, you have old women, you have families essentially. And so often war games just talk about soldiers. And you go on the Kickstarter and the first thing someone says is, I want to play the French. And we said, actually, you can't. The whole point of this game is to highlight the Kabyle people and what happened when the French came in. And it was really a game designed to start a conversation, and it absolutely did that. But it was a very different. I designed that on contract for the sort of co-designer, the publisher, Matt Shoemaker, didn't want to approach a feminist project without a woman designer, and so that was where that came from. It was a great project to work on, but so very different.
That sounds wild. That's really cool.
The first 3 months just reading everything we could get my hands on the conflict, and of course we have an oral culture in the 1870s being decimated by the French, and so everything extant is the colonizer perspective, and so trying to figure out what happened from the point of view of the people was very challenging, but it was kind of fun too, just to sort of dig through and see what we could turn up.
Yeah. Do you feel like there is room now for more like representation of either cultures or races that are just sort of underrepresented or underutilized in an actual gaming world?
I think that there's a lot of voices we haven't heard from yet. And I'm excited because some of the absolutely best gaming experiences out there have been some of those underrepresented voices. And so, I had the amazing fortune of doing a workshop with Jessica Hammer a number of years ago, and she's a designer who's a role-playing game designer, and she and Moira Turkington designed this amazing game called Rosenstrasse about the experience of Jewish people in World War II in Germany, essentially. That's a really bad short telling of that game. But their perspective is like, we want to look across the grain of history and see what got written out. And we want to look for what was missing when we tell this story, because that's where the really compelling stuff is that's relevant to more people than just, the stories of the guns and the battles. There's so much more in there. And so I appreciated having that perspective, and then trying to see, well, okay, in my little way of this project, can I try to learn from that and bring it in here?
Yeah, I guess that would be a time to talk about just as a female designer in board games. Do you feel like there's room to allow young girls to design their games, and how can we make the community more open to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really big question. I think one of the ways is just the initial representation. Putting names and pictures on boxes, talking about, oh yeah, this was designed by a woman, this was designed by a girl, so that young people realize that women do this too. And then, within our communities, kind of looking out for what are the barriers here, and those can vary. I know I've had a lot of challenges in the city here with game design meetups not being transit accessible, and that's something that is a huge barrier. If you're coming as a young woman to something with people you don't know, there needs to be safe transit accessible, and there's things like that. We talk a lot about micro grants for women to hire babysitters to go to game design nights, because generally we break in society, women are expected to stay home with the kids. And while that's not always true, it's often true. And so there are initiatives like that I think we need more of, that sort of look at the different types of barriers and help people get past them too.
I guess, what are your thoughts on why you think people should support independent game designers and game developers, and consider who they're supporting on that?
I just think that there's so much richness that we miss out if we only have sort of these big, big budget, appeal to the most possible people, things out there. There's just so many stories that can be told, and so many interesting things that like I said, that we lose if we don't support those independent people, and really, you know, keep our ears open for people doing things differently. And so yeah, and that's the biggest reason. It's really, the world is so big and varied. Like, why not learn and make space for as much of it as we can?
What do you think? At least recently, I feel like Alberta in general has been really thriving with their board game design community. Why do you think it's been doing really well here in Alberta specifically?
I don't know. That's an interesting question, because I'm not sure if it's anything specific, except for having this, like in Calgary, you've got Roxley Design Studio, which, a lot of the folks involved in that met through the Game Artisans of Canada when that was forming, and they happened to be geographically close, and there happened to be some amazing skill sets that just fit together to create that. But I think it's been, the in Alberta, Falcon Gaming Society has actually definitely, out of Calgary, had a big impact on working to amplify those sort of nascent designer voices, and get them in front of folks. I think that's probably helped. And then the other thing that's super connected is just Alberta has a thriving video game industry, and there is huge overlap there. There absolutely is. I lecture every year at the University of Alberta, in a video game design course, because they teach students analog game design as a part of how to approach video game design, narrative design, all those different things. And I think that there is definitely, they feed each other in sort of ways that you might not always see on the surface, but they're there.
Did you have any concerns? I guess going back to the Kickstarter, did you have any concerns and stuff when it was going to launch at the beginning?
Especially the first time, it's just mostly anxiety about, will anyone like my idea? Will this thing go? Kind of a thing. And, I think everyone creative must deal with that. And I think you deal with it over and over, and it gets a little easier with time. But there's just that vulnerability, right, of putting out something you've created and seeing if other people are interested in it or think it's cool. And I think that would be the biggest thing that I was sort of feeling or concerned about or whatever. But
yes, is there a strong community in Edmonton for designers to meet up and share their designs?
Sort of. There has been, of course, COVID put a lot of that on pause. But there was definitely efforts being made to create spaces for designers to get together, whether it was like the big once a year sort of play test event or whether it was smaller gatherings. We have we're very fortunate, even though we've lost a few through the pandemic, to have great board game cafes here. And those are just perfect. Like, as a designer, board game cafes are my favorite thing.
Do you have a shout out for a favorite board game cafe in Edmonton?
Oh, well, I'm spoiled because, Tabletop Cafe was our first one here, and Brian Flowers, who runs it, is absolutely amazing at what he does and runs a great cafe. But I live and work near White Avenue, where we have Hexagon. And for transit, Board and Brew Cafe downtown is so accessible. So I actually do a lot of playtesting there because all my playtesters from the whole city can easily and safely get to that location. Whether they come on the train or whether they take buses. So, like I said, I'm super spoiled.
Yeah, that's great. I guess touching back on the pandemic, was there any specific troubles or hassles that you found with the pandemic for launching the board game during it?
So for the Kickstarter for that, there wasn't, because that game was completed and signed pre-pandemic. And so that didn't really affect it, except like once it was being produced and everything slowed down because of the supply chain issues that we've all come to know and love. But I did find designing during the pandemic has just been so hard. Like, I still love what I do, but it's also just so isolating when it's such a social thing that you're doing, and to not be able to do the social aspect of it is really, really challenging. So I'm very excited to start doing in-person stuff a little bit more, as people feel safe to do it. But yeah, it is just, like I said, such a social thing. So to try to do that, and even like we have access to Zoom and Tabletop Simulator and all these tools, and they're wonderful. And my goodness, I am so grateful for them. I also hate them because they're still not the same. I can't see where my players are looking on the board. I can't watch them fidget with the pieces. I don't get any of those nonverbal cues, and it's a very different experience doing the work digitally.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind talking about that for a little bit, just as a designer watching people play your game. You had mentioned little cues and things. What very specific things have you noticed that really are make you make changes to your game?
It really, I guess I'm always looking for, is the player experience matching the experience I want them to have? Are they engaged throughout the game? Are they wandering off, losing interest? What's exciting them? And whether that's intentional or not. If there's something they're loving that I didn't even want to be the center of the game, maybe I need to revisit that. Because at the end of the day, it's about how people play it and how they engage with it. And so, when I was working on the Algeria game, the Red Burnous, that game is, you can't win it. It's a cooperative game, and a win condition is to not get defeated by the French by winter. It's going to happen. And so you want people to be engaged and enjoying it, but you're not looking for like happiness, because it's kind of depressing. Whereas Creature Comforts, and Maple Valley that we're just working on now, I want to see people being like, oh, this is so cute, I get to do this, and like really engaging in it in a very different way. So that's the type of thing I'm looking for, is does that match the story I'm telling? Are they getting out of this experience the thing I hope they would?
Yeah, that's ties back to, again, does the game have a story as you're playing through it? Mm-hmm. And I think connecting people to that game is all about getting them to be a part of that story.
Exactly. Yeah. You want them, it's really fun listening to someone tell about a game they played and tell it in that narrative way, and I've seen that with people who play chess, but I've also, my favorite example is always cooperative zombie games where someone does something stupid and everyone dies. And I mean, goodness, there's a story to retell, right? And it's very memorable, and I love that about games.
That's awesome. Do you have any designs in the works right now for the future?
Oh yeah, so well, we just announced Maple Valley, which is set in the Creature Comforts universe with Kids Table, and so that is coming, I believe, late fall 22. I've got a few other things that are in different stages that are not public yet, but that are really exciting, and I'm dying for them to be announced so that I can get excited about them with people. But yeah, and then of course there's always those games that I'm working on that I haven't found a publisher for or whatever, but that I'm still excited about, and so yeah, lots of different stuff on the go.
Yeah, I hopefully we can get a little bit more time in person to meet up with people and actually, go through and show off some of these games and projects that we've been working on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's about it for me. Thank you so much again for your time, Roberta. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's been great catching up with you as well, and I wish you all the success in all the upcoming projects you have.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm just going to say goodbye to people, and thanks again for tuning in.